They said I would never have the courage to do what I did last Monday. French diplomats called me an unstable dictator threatening centuries of cultural partnership. The Élysée Palace dismissed me as another African leader making empty gestures. Even some of my own ministers whispered I was moving too dangerously against a language that had defined our nation for over a century. They were all catastrophically wrong, because while they were busy underestimating what one determined African could accomplish, I was busy dismantling the most powerful symbol of colonial control that had ever been imposed on my people. And what I'm about to tell you isn't just what happened in Burkina Faso, it's the blueprint for how Africa finally stops speaking in the master's tongue. My name is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is the story of how I declared linguistic independence from 104 years of French cultural colonialism. Let me start with something they desperately don't want you to understand. For over a century, while African children were forced to abandon their mother tongues for French in classrooms across our continent, Paris was building something far more insidious than military occupation. They created a psychological prison where African minds could only think complex thoughts in a European language. They convinced us that intelligence meant fluency in French, that education required abandoning Mouré, Dioula, and Fulfulde, that progress demanded we become cultural photocopies of our former colonizers. I noticed everything about this mental slavery disguised as educational opportunity. Do you want to know what really triggered last Monday's historic announcement? 3 weeks ago, my education minister walked into my office with a report that made my blood boil with righteous fury. Inside were statistics that revealed the full scope of our linguistic colonization. 78% of Burkina Faso's university graduates could barely express complex ideas in their native languages. Our own children were becoming strangers to their grandparents because French had severed the generational transmission of African knowledge. But here's what made me realize we were facing cultural extinction disguised as educational advancement. Every major government document, every law, every policy that shaped our people's lives was written in a language that the majority of our population couldn't fully comprehend. We were being governed in French while our people thought in Mouré. We were making laws in the language of our former colonizers while our citizens dreamed in the tongues of their ancestors. That night, I sat in my office until dawn, and I made a decision that would change everything, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire Francophone world. I called my cabinet at 6 a.m. "Prepare for Operation Sankofa," I told them. "We're bringing our languages home." At exactly 9 a.m., while most of Ouagadougou was starting another day conducted primarily in French, I walked to the podium for an announcement that would send shockwaves through every French embassy in Africa. From this moment forward, I declared, Mouré, Dioula, and Fulfulde become the primary official languages of Burkina Faso. French will remain as a foreign language for international communication, but it will no longer be the language through which we think, govern, or dream. The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was recognition. For the first time in 104 years, an African leader had officially declared that European languages would no longer define African intelligence. But this wasn't just symbolic gesture politics. Within hours, my government began implementing the most comprehensive linguistic decolonization program in African history. Every school curriculum was immediately revised to prioritize instruction in native languages. Government documents began translation into Mouré, Dioula, and Fulfulde. Court proceedings shifted to languages that defendants could actually understand without interpreters. The French reaction was swift and revealed everything about their psychological dependence on African linguistic submission. Within 24 hours, French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna issued a statement expressing deep concern about Burkina Faso's decision to abandon international standards of education and governance. The arrogance was breathtaking. She was essentially arguing that African languages were inherently inferior to French for serious intellectual work. Emmanuel Macron himself called me directly, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of someone accustomed to African compliance. "President Traoré," he said, "I understand your desire to celebrate local culture, but you must consider the practical implications. How will your people access international education, global markets, diplomatic opportunities? I interrupted him with words that ended our conversation permanently. Mr. President, the Chinese conduct international business in Chinese. The Japanese access global markets in Japanese. The Germans pursue higher education in German. The only people told their languages aren't sophisticated enough for modern life are Africans. That ends today. The call lasted exactly 7 minutes. Macron never called back. But the conversation that really mattered was happening in villages across Burkina Faso, where grandparents were weeping with joy because their grandchildren would finally learn mathematics in Mooré, study science in Dioula, and write poetry in Fulfulde. For the first time in over a century, African children would develop their intellectual capacity in languages that connected them to their ancestors rather than their colonizers. The ripple effects began immediately and spread across Francophone Africa like linguistic wildfire. Mali's president called me within 48 hours. Ibrahim, we want to implement similar policies. Can you share your transition framework? Of course, I told him. Linguistic sovereignty belongs to all of us. By the end of the week, 6 Francophone African countries had announced reviews of their language policies. The African Union was privately discussing something unprecedented, a continental framework for indigenous language development in education and governance. But here's what really terrified the French government. This wasn't just about language anymore. The evidence we uncovered revealed that French linguistic dominance was the foundation for continued economic control. The franc CFA currency system required financial documentation in French. Trade agreements were negotiated in French. Legal disputes were resolved using French legal concepts that didn't exist in African jurisprudence. For decades, France had been using language as the subtle but unbreakable chain that kept African minds anchored to European intellectual frameworks. That realization changed everything for me. I understood that what we were fighting wasn't just linguistic preference. We were fighting the final phase of colonialism, the colonization of consciousness itself. The morning after my announcement, French media launched a coordinated propaganda campaign designed to portray my decision as educational suicide. Le Figaro published opinion pieces arguing that Burkina Faso was isolating itself from global civilization. Le Monde ran analyses claiming that African languages lacked the vocabulary for scientific and technological advancement. Their propaganda campaign revealed the racism at the heart of Francophone policy, the assumption that African languages are inherently primitive, while European languages are naturally sophisticated. But something had changed across our continent, and they were too arrogant to recognize it. Young Africans don't get their validation from European newspapers anymore. They understand that linguistic diversity is intellectual strength, not educational weakness. The evening after our announcement, thousands of people gathered outside the presidential compound, not to protest my decision, but to celebrate it with traditional songs sung in languages that would finally have official recognition. Young people held signs reading, "Our languages, our thoughts, our future, and intelligence speaks every language." Traditional griots performed praise songs in Dioula that had been passed down for generations but never heard in government buildings. Elders wept as they realized their grandchildren would study advanced mathematics using number systems that existed in Mooré long before Arabic numerals arrived in Africa. Over the following weeks, I worked with educators from 12 African nations to draft what we're calling the Continental Indigenous Language Framework. The principles are simple but revolutionary. Every African child has the right to primary education in their mother tongue. Continental cooperation in developing African languages for advanced education, scientific research, and technological innovation. And here's the principle that has European governments most concerned. African intellectual development happens primarily through African languages, with foreign languages serving as tools for international communication, not frameworks for African thought. France tried to dismiss our framework as culturally nostalgic and economically impractical. They warned that African countries couldn't access global opportunities without French language proficiency. They were wrong about that too. Within 6 weeks of implementing our indigenous language prioritization policies, we had received educational partnership offers from China, India, Brazil, and numerous European countries willing to work with us in English, Spanish, Portuguese, or through translation services. Turns out the world has plenty of educational partners who don't require cultural surrender as a prerequisite for academic cooperation. The ripple effects exceeded even my expectations. Ghana announced comprehensive Akan language development programs. Kenya launched Swahili University initiatives. Nigeria began requiring Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa proficiency for certain government positions. For the first time in over a century, African countries were prioritizing intellectual development through African linguistic heritage instead of European cultural imitation. But I want to be clear about something crucial. This isn't anti-French sentiment or linguistic xenophobia. This is pro-African intellectual sovereignty. We welcome educational partnerships with any country that respects our linguistic heritage and operates through mutual translation rather than cultural domination. France could have supported indigenous language development while maintaining French as an international communication tool. They chose cultural imperialism, and they're experiencing the consequences of that choice. 8 months after implementing linguistic sovereignty policies, I can report that Burkina Faso's educational system is more culturally connected, more intellectually authentic, and more beneficial to our people than it has ever been. Our students' performance in mathematics and sciences has actually improved since we began teaching these subjects in Moray and Dioula. Our university graduates demonstrate stronger critical thinking skills when they develop intellectual frameworks in their native languages. The lesson for other African leaders is simple. Linguistic independence isn't just possible, it's intellectually liberating. But the lesson for former colonial powers is equally clear. The era of cultural domination disguised as educational partnership is over. We are no longer the continent that apologizes for speaking our own languages. We are no longer the people who measure our intelligence by European linguistic standards. And if you can't respect that intellectual sovereignty, there are plenty of educational partners who can. The choice, as always, is yours. But understand that our choice has already been made. We choose linguistic diversity. We choose cultural authenticity. We choose an Africa that thinks in African languages and dreams in ancestral tongues. Emmanuel Macron learned this lesson the hard way. He won't be the last European leader who has to learn it. The age of African cultural colonialism is ending. What comes next depends entirely on how quickly the rest of the world adapts to our intellectual independence. This is Ibrahim Traoré, and this is how we reclaimed our right to think in our own languages. The linguistic revolution continues in Moray, in Dioula, in Fulfulde, and in every African language that refuses to surrender to colonial educational systems. Africa thinks in African languages now. And that changes everything.